Culture seminar program, and it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce a dear friend, Dr. Ian Claussen. Dr. Claussen is a colleague of mine in the Augustine and Culture seminar program here at Villanova University, where he's an Arthur J. Ennis postdoctoral fellow. Dr. Claussen completed his PhD at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, having received the British Marshall Scholarship. And he studied Augustine there under the direction of Professor Oliver O'Donovan, who's a giant in the field of Augustinian theology. And in his research, Dr. Claussen focuses on Augustine in his historical time and place. And in this way, he seeks to bring alive a very human Augustine. But at the same time, he also asks, with Augustine, the perennial questions concerning especially moral agency, moral conscience, and the complexities of human divine love. And it's this spirit of moving back and forth between the perennial questions and looking at Augustine in his context and time that makes Dr. Claussen such a great teacher, as many of his students are here today and know, as well as a great thinker. And it's in that spirit of this seeing Augustine in these two ways that he's going to give us a talk today on his recently completed and eagerly anticipated book called On Love, Confession, Surrender, and the Moral Self. I think it'll be for sale later on today too, so it's a little plug for that. This is part of a new series from Bloomsbury Press that's titled Reading Augustine. And Dr. Claussen contributes to this series, and it's aimed to, quote, make clear Augustine's importance to contemporary thought. I'm very proud of my friend, and I'm grateful that he would share with us today some remarks on this book, a book born out of a loving struggle to think not just about Augustine, but also with Augustine. And the result is a really wonderful guide for students and teachers alike in and through the intellectual journey that Augustine took. A journey that Augustine described as going from the exterior to the interior and from the inferior to the superior. And as Dr. Claussen reminds us, and as I'm sure you'll talk about today, it's the weight of love that carries us along that journey into the self and, if we let it, upwards in return to our creative origin. So please join me in congratulating Dr. Claussen on the completion of this book and in thanking him for his remarks today.
Longer introduction than I gave him, so thank you, Dr. Camacho.
Hold the mic up more.
Sure. All right. So it's difficult to know how to approach a book talk. It's not strictly speaking a lecture or a paper. I wouldn't want to bore you with one of those at this hour. Nor is it meant to be a comprehensive book summary, as I wouldn't want to deter the 2 or 3 of you who intend to buy it. Yet, if not a lecture or a paper or summary, a book talk may be in danger of becoming something else. A story, God forbid, about its author. Now, that I can assure you is not my intention, as tempting an intention as it is for modern people. Perhaps Augustine bears some of the blame for this fact. Expressive individualism is an easily mocked phenomenon, but it is also easily indulged and abused in sundry ways. In my wrestling with Augustine over the last 10 years, a phrase which I still find odd to employ, the last 10 years, I've come to appreciate that Confessions is a supremely audacious book, the kind of thing one should think twice, or maybe many more times than twice, about attempting to write oneself. I have not, thank God, tried to make such an attempt, nor is this book in any way a comprehensive guide to the Confessions. If it does offer something to the student of Confessions, and I hope it does, it is to be found in its pursuit of a particular haunting question. And students in my ACS class will know this question well. It is a question that we encounter at the climactic moment in Genesis 3, where God is said to have spoken aloud into the absence and uneasy silence, "Where are you?" Before I get to that, I want to make sure I say a few thank yous. First, to Dr. Mary Lou Hill, director of the Augustine and Culture Seminar Program, who made the effort to convince me that giving a book talk would be a good idea. We shall see if that's the case. Thank you, for that matter, to all my colleagues in ACS who undoubtedly have heard enough about Augustine to last a lifetime, and certainly enough about Augustine from me. To Ms. Regina Duffy of Falvey Library, Ms. Bernadette Mania at Villanova Bookstore, and anyone else involved in setting up in this event, many thanks indeed for your hospitality and flexibility. The university apparently decided in the aftermath of their NCAA tournament victory that a book talk on Augustine was not an appropriate way to celebrate. And I'm thankful for that too. And finally, as I say in the acknowledgments of my book, I want to thank Mary Beth Simmons and Mary Weatherup at the Writing Center, the latter of whom stepped in to help me work on my plain English, my struggles with which can be, shall we say, considerable. Oh yes, and to my students, previous and current, who often challenge me to think about Augustine in new ways. Thank you. All right, back to God's question in Genesis 3. It is an interesting question, to be sure, an unexpected one. And for a thinker metaphysically inclined, as indeed Augustine was, it is a moment that cannot help but cause some awkward discomfort. Of course, Augustine assures us in his first commentary on Genesis, God isn't asking, "Where are you?" out of ignorance. That would be the interpretation of his former co-religionists, the Manichees, whose flat-footed biblical literalism never failed to annoy Augustine. But here, at least, there is something more at stake. A problem not simply of interpretation, but of salvation. The idea that God's question is a know-nothing shot in the dark, as if God didn't know what transpired in the Garden of Eden, is, of course, theologically speaking, an affront to God's nature. That is, if we subscribe to omniscience and omnipotence. But more essentially for Augustine, and indeed for us as well, for Augustine is, of course, adamant that we confront the biblical text, not just observe it as a spectator. This idea of God, that God's question is a shot in the dark, is itself a subtle evasion of the question God puts to us. Where are you? In this moment, to squabble over the sin just committed, as Adam and Eve do, or to ponder the inscrutable reason that this sin was even possible, as the skeptic might do, or to ridicule the text for such glaring anthropomorphisms, as do the Manichees and many readers down the centuries. This is not to engage God's question at all, but to deflect it, putting off the invitation it communicates. This attempt at communication is a grace in itself. It invites the agent to step forward and to acknowledge herself before God. Here I am, embracing whatever this position may entail and imply, as Abraham in Genesis. Not exactly the easiest thing to do, you can imagine. And in fact, often not the most desirable thing either, even for we humans who are a due part of God's creation, to echo the start of Confessions. Here my book uses and repurposes a popular saying, which I borrow from Rowan Williams, who apparently borrows it from someone else, that for humans, in multiple ways and for various reasons, the hardest thing in the world is to be where we are. The hardest thing in the world is to be where we are. That place, which is not simply geographical, but moral, though often it's both, is where we come to confront a concrete claim on our attention, a claim that summons us to agent identity. In Genesis 3, we might say then, Augustine discerns the claim of God. It is a claim unlike any other claim we might receive, a call that not only summons us, but reestablishes our faltering agency. As I put it in the book, it is a call that holds us in place, a call that stands in the gap between our innocent intentions, sometimes retroactively instated, and our clever attempts to deny what we have done or failed to do. And what do I mean by holds us in place? In the book, I quote a passage from the Jewish philosopher Abraham Heschel, whom my students have been reading, whose book, God in Search of Man, brings to light this mysterious question. Mrs. Heschel. It is a cry that goes out again and again. It is a small voice, not uttered in words, not conveyed in categories of the mind, but ineffable and mysterious. As ineffable and mysterious as the glory that fills the whole world. It is wrapped in silence, concealed and subdued, yet it is as if all things were the frozen echo of the question, where are you? For Augustine, God's question is both invitation and judgment. Indeed, it is invitation by way of a judgment. As a place where God calls us, God occupies already, knowing all that we might say and could say in our defense. Yet God still asks the question, and I'm sure that haunted Augustine. Not simply because of how the Manichees would misinterpret it, he could deal with that, but more so because, in a certain sense, we know this question well. We know it. In our bones, we feel it all the way down, as if it sets off a spring deep within our being, knowing and willing. And if ever there comes a time where we venture a response, and the entirety of our lives might be viewed as a continuous response, punctuated by key points of self-reckoning and conversion, in that moment of response, we might find ourselves, well, transforming, joining Augustine beneath the fig tree, crying tears of penitence and surrender. This is, at any rate, how I read Confessions 8, the so-called moment of Augustine's moral conversion. Though containing more layers than one reading could discover, once we put God's question into the frame of Book 8, it is difficult not to hear it echoing across the entire landscape. A passage from chapter 1 of my book tries to describe it. Here, Augustine coming to terms with his location before God. So this is a quote from the book. Apologies. For so long, having refused to admit his condition, Augustine begins to reestablish responsible contact with the truth. Set down before my face and made aware of his iniquity, naked, he identifies self-deception as the root of his sickness. I had been aware of it, he writes, now able to admit it. Why had he failed to admit it before? Why is he able to admit it now? Possibly his ability to confess at this moment is the result of his unwillingness and inability to move. He is stuck. He cannot and wills not to hide. Standing here in the place of moral conscience, he collapses the distance between himself and himself. From the depths of self-deception, he emerges through conscience, which discloses the secrets that were buried from his view. And here I quote a scholar of conscience. It describes conscience as one self hiding the guilty secret, the other self sharing it. He is no longer hiding himself from himself. His confession is the act of both mending and exposing, laying bare the sinful divisions that tear up his heart. Though not yet arrived, he has certainly arrived somewhere. And this place is the place held in place by God's question. Where are you? In life, we do not need a concrete command to be good, nor do we need to be told generally that we are responsible. A condition of self-knowledge is that we are, in fact, responsible. And apart from having discovered that, there is no self-knowledge. At the same time, to know myself as a responsible moral agent is to encounter a moral claim that transcends my concrete experience. Such a claim invites the agent to give account of itself, to testify to the truth of who I am or have become. While society will oblige us to commit specific actions, it cannot claim for us an account of who I am in the totality. Yet we do often experience such a summons to give an account. And our lives would be more impoverished if we simply ceased to respond to it, giving up on the challenge of bringing our lives to a point, as they say. In that sense, we might think of God's question, where are you, as conveying the prior summons that secretly holding us in place. The question that is there on the scene before we are, standing guard against the lies and self-deception that afflict us. Well, I call this place at other points in the book the moral self. Now, this is not the book to give a definitive interpretation of the Augustinian self, but my effort in part is to identify certain conditions that I consider to be essential to interpreting that self. One of those conditions is the self as a lover. For Augustine, we are, quote, lovers all the time and all the way down, end quote. Augustine's famous claim sets the tone for this assessment. My weight is my love, and wherever I am carried, it is this weight that carries me. Love as the soul's weight. Love is my weight, but love as something forceful that moves me and propels me. As a graduate student, I was impressed by this notion of a love that goes before us. A love that, as I tried to explain it at one point, quote, is always operating just below the surface, forging new bonds, reinforcing old attachments, claiming for us any number of causes and pursuits. This love that is intimately woven into who and what we are, and which functions as a condition for the possibility of our being, knowing, and willing. This love is not something that we simply control, as if love were merely the extension of an autonomous act of choice. It is something more primordial than a will-powered choice, a movement prior to our active intelligence and agency. From time to time in our life, we wake up to this love, discovering that here is where I am and where I'm going. In that respect, love is also intimately tied to our place. God's question, "Where are you?" might be read as a probing of love, intended to draw attention to what it is that we love, what it is that we're chasing, what it is that is driving us either toward or away from the truth, or the good, or the beautiful. For all of that, it is evident that the question of place, "Where are you?" extends even to the moments when we lack moral awareness. An example could be found in Augustine's infancy account in Confessions. As difficult as it is to think an infant responsible, much less culpable for things like greediness and selfishness, Augustine's overriding concern in this infamous passage is to account for his location when he could not give an account. Little by little, he writes, peering back into a hidden past, I began to notice where I was, and I would try to make my wishes known to those who might satisfy them. Of course, it is theologically accurate to say that God was with Augustine as he lived as an infant. But that is not the only one there with Augustine. And indeed, if it were, he would have ceased to have been. Much more is taking place in this period of development. The infant self is being constituted and nurtured in this moment, as it communicates its needs and reaches out for another who is there before it. This is what I make of the passage at one point. The beginning of the infant's recognition of its place gains ground through expressing its need for the other. In the infant's dawning awareness of his place in the world, Augustine finds a useful analogy for his present adult struggles. Just as infants stand helpless in their place before others, so Augustine stands helpless to recall his own infancy. By relying on other people, their testimony, and infants through inference, for insight, he can begin to draw a picture of that shrouded period of life. As he does, he realizes that his needs and desires had been met by some other who had been there all along, his mother, Monica. The self as othered is the self as mothered, for mothers stand to provide what the infant cannot give itself, a place. Later in Confessions, Augustine recalls Monica's dream in which an angel prophetically assures her that where she stood, there also stood I. Monica, we might say, held a place for her son. Her prayers communicated the presence of the God who holds us, calling and even begging us to be where we are. So one of the contributions I try to make in this book is to demonstrate how alert Augustine is to the world around him, to the other that is more than just a being out there, but who is enmeshed and entangled in his most intimate sense of self, as a lover. Of course, it is God who is more intimate to us than anyone, including ourselves. But God is not competitive with those who stand among us. What that means is for Augustine, unlike, I am told, for someone like Plato, our personal stories and histories are not incidental to the self. God is there in the stories and histories we live out, not as one who absorbs and overwhelms their particular contents, but as one who strengthens and enlightens and orders their significance. But I return once again to Rowan Williams' dictum: the hardest thing in the world is to be where we are. If ignorance is one factor and self-deception is another, there are also times when where we are threatens to overwhelm our agency. We find ourselves radically questioned in our being, knowing, willing. Our very sense of reality is destabilized, brought to its knees. And what is left in that moment is a flickering, faltering love, which we want to remove but cannot escape, for to do so would be to extinguish our very selves in the process. I'm speaking, of course, of Confessions, Book 4, that famous moment when Augustine mourns the loss of his friend from Tagast. It is here that I pause to bring my students into the mix, if they're here already. There's a few of them. In class, we have been wrestling with the writings of Simone Weil, one of those philosophers with a knack for getting under one's skin. In her essay, which is headlined by the imposing title, The Love of God in Affliction, Weil reflects on the astonishing features of the afflicted among us. People, she says, we cannot see unless we see through the eyes of Christ. For Weil, grief is one form that affliction takes. A long shadow extending over the world we inhabit, shrouding the landscape that moments ago was so familiar. Grief is felt not merely in the mind or in the social relations, but physically it crawls through us, pulses within us, like a possession that renders us unrecognizable to ourselves, and makes us dread where we find ourselves to be at that moment. In these moments, says Weil, the soul is in danger. And what she says about this danger bears directly on Augustine. This is Weil. Affliction renders God absent for a time, more absent than a dead man, more absent than the light in a completely dark cell. A sort of horror submerges the whole soul. During this absence, there is nothing to love. What is terrible is that in this darkness, when there is nothing to love, if the soul ceases to love, the absence of God becomes definitive. The soul must continue to love in the void, or at least want to love, be it even with an infinitesimal part of itself. Well, you can imagine how a young man studying theology overseas, with all the angst and uncertainty and sense of inadequacy that entails, would find this passage somewhat alarming and chilling in its description. As if alighting upon some terrible new species of animal, or like Frankenstein, hiding away from the monster he had just summoned. This man might run away and try to forget what he had learned, maybe try the Scottish haggis as a hilarious distraction, or practice his Scottish brogue to blend in with his environment. Suffice it to say, I did not find these employments of much help. Neither did Augustine let me get off the hook, and I suspect that many readers of his account in Book 4 have likewise found it difficult to dodge and to shake. Well, here is what finally came out in the book when I turned to Book 4, and again listening for the question, where are you? This is a slightly longer quotation. In Book 4, Augustine relates the tragic death of his childhood friend, an unnamed companion he had cherished very dearly. In a way, this event marks a moment of decisive clarity, but not before he suffers the excruciating pain of separation. The process is vividly described by the philosopher Simone Weil. But there is an unspeakable wrench in the soul at the separation of a desire from its object. For Weil, this pain is part of the process of purification. It illuminates the truth of our position in the world. In Book 4, Augustine undergoes a similar process, which renders him at once more transparent and opaque. The loss of his friend means his home is taken from him, forcing the retraction of desire from the world. This desire now stripped of its intended worldly object, it presses down upon Augustine with the weight of indeterminacy. It needs to have an object. It demands to be placed, but the object it seeks is no longer there on the horizon. Scanning this horizon for his friend now gone, Augustine sinks into a loneliness and darkness overnight. Black grief closed over my heart, Augustine writes, and wherever I looked, I saw only death. My native land was a torment to me, and my father's house unbelievable misery. Everything I had shared with my friend turned into hideous anguish within me. That friend was home, and now home is not the same. Death demolished the home that gave Augustine to himself. There opens then a rift between Augustine and himself, unleashing piercing questions that will challenge his position. He writes, I had become a great enigma to myself, and I questioned my soul, demanding why it was sorrowful and why it so disquieted me, but it had no answer. Indeed, he cannot stand in his place anymore, if even one can call it a place anymore. Trying to lodge hope in a false view of God, hope, quote, would slip through that insubstantial thing and fall back again on me, who had remained myself an unhappy place where I could not live, but from which I could not escape. Where could I go and leave myself behind? Was there any place of refuge where I could not be followed by my own self? His loss makes him face the haunting truth of who he is, a lover still in need of a place to call home, and a mortal destined to suffer the same fate as his friend. Of course, Augustine here is not just recounting, but confessing. And as an indictment of his grief, it can be troubling for the reader to read. I try to make sense, or some sense, of his confession and self-critique. But what I think Augustine would want us to understand about this moment, and what I think in her own way Simone Weil would echo as well, is that the experience of grief is not an exceptional occurrence. It is not a rank absurdity, which we can say nothing about. It is an experience, in fact, that demands something from us. And those who bear that demand and respond to it truthfully, without evasion, without cheap consolation, ought to command a measure of respect as Simone Weil puts it, a pure marvel of truth and authenticity. In that case, Weil is thinking of the example of Job. It was Job who refused the consolations of his friends, who dared to speak honestly and adamantly, yet continued to love. I love how Weil puts it in her brief reflection at following the passage I just quoted. Then one day, she's thinking of the end of the book of Job, God comes to manifest himself to the afflicted and reveals the beauty of the world. God, she says at one point, is dragged down from the heavens by Job's desire, manifesting a beauty far too wondrous for Job to know, or for any of us to know. I do not know if Job is the one Augustine has in mind, but when he proceeds to critique the consolations he sought from his other friends, he is conveying that he was hiding from the place he was in, the place where God was waiting for him. In fact, I might sum up the purpose of this book as a reflection on how Augustine, through various means and setting, invites humanity out of its hiding place, to awaken to the light. This is something he does well before he writes the Confessions. In fact, the last 3 chapters deal specifically with 3 early works, written within about a 5-year period after his conversion, which try to elicit and facilitate an intellectual rebirth of the soul, awakening it to the truth of its being, knowing, willing. In that sense, I argue, Augustine's early works are a kind of continuous engagement with the idea of the moral self. Not that Augustine always knew what he was doing with that self, nor indeed that he knew all that that self had to involve, but that, being committed to the act of confession, he would slowly begin to uncover what it means to be a moral self, and through that process would bestow a precious gift on later generations, a moral self that has prospered to this day in our moral imaginaries. So I want to close then with a few paragraphs from the conclusion of the book. For Augustine, confession is a form of self-knowing that relinquishes control over the place of the self. It is not, however, a total self-surrender, but paradoxically gives the self back to itself in truth. By in truth, we mean God holds the place of the self. God does not abandon his creation to its fate. Instead, calling it back to its place before him, God reveals the truth of the way things are, including the moral realities that confront and engage us. In our reading, Augustine's journey is a continuous unfolding of the many sundry ways God remains where we are, more intimately present to me than my inmost being. In this way, self-knowledge is not an end in itself, but unfolds in the infinite mystery and otherness of God. Moreover, precisely because it is a place of confession, the moral self does not cease to take part in the world, even though Augustine was once tempted to do so. Confession is the way one navigates the world, attending to the call echoing across the moral landscape. One hears that call in the mundane and the extraordinary, in a landscape ever shifting, difficult to map, and full of distractions. It is there in the experience of ourselves as moral agents, in the moment we are summoned to be where we are, and in the moment we accept or decline that summons. In this light, the accusation often lodged against Augustine, that he is too otherworldly and not attentive to embodied reality, has a tendency, it must be said, to ignore how God's call animates the self. There are indeed events that ground us, encounters that command us, but none is sufficient to give an account to the self. Part of why they cannot give account to the self is that they pose, without resolving, the haunting questions of existence. To experience the world without these questions in view, to ignore them, suppress them, even deny them altogether, is to entertain the atomization and dissolution of the self, to attack the very idea of human community, denying this community any place in the world. In the last analysis, The abiding invitation of Augustine's legacy is to reclaim by surrendering the place of confession. Surrendering to, excuse me. The question, where are you, lives on in our age, for it is a question not based on human being, knowing, willing. It comes to us in love, and is received by us through love. For love is the beginning and the end of our journey. As Augustine puts it, give me a lover, and he will know by experience what I am saying. Give me a man of desires. Give me someone who is traveling thirsty through this wilderness and panting for the fountain of eternal life, and he will know what I am saying. In an age that calls us into question all the time, having taken so much from our humanity already, Augustine suggests that there is a question that holds us in place. Come down then, he says, and find rest for your souls. Thank you. So hopefully that was clear enough. Are there any questions about what I said? Or process of writing it? Or? Yeah. Yeah, you.
Thank you very much. Can I do a somewhat dangerous thing and invite you to, I wonder if you have a thought about to what extent is what you're talking about, the question of where are you? To what extent does that engage what we might think of today as authenticity? And if I can venture one thing, it seems like a lot of that is based around sort of the external, right? What culture do you grow up in? What type of family do you grow up in? What are the values that you have been given by people outside yourself, right? So is Augustine sort of, is he reclaiming a sort of inner voice? And my vocabulary on this is very bad, I know, but any thoughts on that?
So is he reclaiming? So can I slightly rephrase it?
Yeah.
Is he more or less consistent with what we tend to today value as authenticity? Like is he pro authenticity, like pro, being in touch with who you are and your cultural, social, familial, so on background? Is that more or less the question, or does he somehow say yes and no to that, or even critique it?
Does he? I mean, I from your talk, it seemed like he would be he might be a critic of that, right?
Sure.
That yourself is sort of so much wrapped up in I don't know, culture, like the outside in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think his commitment to his faith in God would not allow him to let the self be absorbed into merely what we might today call a sociological description of the self, or like a complete, total description of what we are. There is, the word's a really bad one, but like a transcendent aspect of the self, and that was a little bit of what I talked about. The question points in that direction. There are things that nature can tell us about ourselves and that society can tell us about ourselves. There are things that society can even oblige us to do, but society cannot, and the wills of other people cannot ground who we are, and cannot, and should not. I think that's a dangerous thing. If we were able to do that, we would lose something like the moral self, something that that isn't easy to pin down, nevertheless, but is nevertheless animated by and energized by and this encounter with something that is, as he puts it, higher than the highest part of my soul, more intimate to me than inmost self, right? So I think, and I don't know, if the nature of sort of the ethics of authenticity necessarily preclude that transcendent aspect, but I know some people who might be more reductive in their thinking about itself. But I would also at the same time say that transcendent encounter we have with God does not dissolve sometimes it seems like that in Augustine, to dissolve all the worldly relations and obligations and things that we have. Augustine, particularly his early works, has a tendency sometimes to rise up and never come back down, right? Or come back down only begrudgingly because he can't maintain his position. And so there would be a conversation there about how authenticity would take different forms depending on, practical judgment in situations. But I think, what he gets right is that I think that question that can't be, that it isn't actually telling us to do any one thing, right? The where are you question. And that's the beauty of a Genesis 3 story, like a mythological kind of story of the self, is that it's not telling us to do one thing, but it is opening that space for the self, the moral self, to emerge, to be a responsible moral agent, and have the dignity of that, even, you could say, in a way that isn't reducible to all the things that transpired beforehand and could transpire after. Does that make sense? That's my best shot. But really good question. Yes.
So it struck me, envisioning you as a graduate student in Edinburgh, enjoying your haggis. I don't know if you enjoyed it. But it seems, is it fair to say that there's something maybe a little unique about Augustine, to study Augustine, that he doesn't just let you off the hook and study him. At some point, it sounds like you have to engage with the questions he raises. At least it's what it sounds like. This was coming out of not just, let me just read this, but this is, I actually had to figure out these questions for myself. Can you speak to how does that impact thinking about scholarship, thinking about teaching, any of these kind of, because how often we think, you're just studying something, but it doesn't really have any impact on your life.
Yeah.
It sounds like this did. So, challenges and good results.
Right.
So,
Well, I'll decline to offer a sob story on my journey, my torturous journey through the PhD. Suffice to say, for those of you who are interested in graduate work, it can be a very trying experience, and depending on what you're studying, it can also confront you from that angle, right? When what you're reading is actually getting to you, or in some sort of way. And actually, I think, just as an aside, I think graduate schools do a very poor job of reckoning with that. They don't have a lot of, realize that some of the things we study can be, I wouldn't say traumatic, but they can be challenging, and it's not just the challenge of writing about it afterwards, but the challenge of actually existentially, morally, spiritually coming to terms with what has been said and what has been done. So yes, Augustine's I think there are perennial thinkers who are like that, and Simone Weil would be another, and Plato would be another, in different ways. I think what makes Augustine unique, what was unique from my experience, because I went to Scotland with a religious studies degree, an English degree. I had never read the Confessions. And so, at least I don't remember reading it, which probably meant I didn't read it.
you didn't go to Villanova.
Right, exactly. Yeah, University of Illinois, right? So I wasn't going to read that there. But when I did encounter it, and and I had the very British hands-off approach to graduate education. So in some ways I was sort of thrown to the wolves. Not that Augustine's a wolf, but the questions I had were very ill-formed, and there wasn't a whole lot of holding my hand through it. And that was a challenge. And I still think it's actually through programs like ACS that I'm beginning to recover my love of reading and exploring. But I think Augustine there are a few thinkers in life that are companions along the way. And you just will continue to go back to them and see what they say. And when you grow up, as I'm trying to grow up intellectually, you learn not to take their word for everything. As I'm starting to do with Augustine, believe it or not, or Simone Weil, or any of the others that I've been reading. But you do recognize that they did something maybe unintentionally for us that is a treasure. And hopefully in ACS you encounter some of those figures that you will go through some of these experiences, and you will want to have language for it, and you will want to have examples or stories that you can draw on. And Augustine's one of those, I think, even in his cranky moments. But especially, yes, we get cranky. So yeah, that's around. There's a lot more to be said about that. But I think, Yeah, and that makes it challenging to write in a different way, because it's not just, you no longer care just about the ideas and plotting. And there's actually an analogy in the book that I borrow, I think from David Tracy, that says some thinkers are like climbing Mont Blanc, where you get to the top of the mountain, it's an arduous climb, but then you see everything, like it's all just laid out before you in the horizon. And he says thinkers like Kant are like that, right? You just master Kant and you know Kant inside out. And then some thinkers are like the city of Rome, where you can go there 10 or 12 times and get lost every time, and the city doesn't make any sense. And it's a complete mess, Roma chaos, right? And he says, yeah, Augustine and Wittgenstein and other thinkers like that are like that. You just don't try to connect the dots. Just dwell, abide in, right? Live with for a while. And I think those are I tend to find myself in Rome more than on Mont Blanc, but there we are. So
Food's better.
food's better, yeah. Yes?
Just to go on one of your prompts, what was the process like changing the dissertation into a book? Because it sounds like a very meditative and even personal book, which isn't exactly the sort of dissertation. What did you have to go through?
Yeah, so I've been, apologies if you've heard this line from me already, but I've been saying this to myself partly to justify my publishing it. When I finally got to the later stages of, actually pulling this together and adding new material as you do, it felt like it was my 32-year-old self trying to make sense of my 25-year-old self and the concerns I had then. And eventually just giving up and saying, well, we're going to let him have his say, and the 25-year-old self. And, you move on often from what you've been working on for a long time, and you have different things that energize you. So I think that bringing into this sort of book is very different from what a typical first book might be for a scholar, because it's styled as a kind of personal reading of Augustine. And the series is very interested in, as Dr. Camacho put it eloquently, the interface between what Augustine thought in his time and place and what we think in our time and place, and how those two aren't. In some ways they're a lot different, but in other ways he can help us navigate our own world. And so that was a challenge. In fact, some points in this book it feels like two separate books, and you're trying to pull together these. I'm reading Cicero. I'm dealing with the academic skeptics. There's no one knows these. Very few people know these movements inside out, or would call themselves an academic skeptic today. And yet, what they're doing there is what the academic skeptics stand for. There are traces of it, and repurposed and refashioned in our own age, so we can learn something from it. But it's actually really hard to put it. Plus, I had a word limit, which is. You would think that would be a good thing, but it's difficult to scrunch it all in. So I think that challenge, this is almost a book that I wish I would have written when I was 65, and I'd just written 3 books and whatever, and can now come back and just sort of walk with Augustine back through my life and show all the things he knows. So it's very much, I think probably in 10, 15 years when I read this again, if I ever do. Right. There'll be an abridged, amended version where a marginalia is like, actually, this is a 25-year-old speaking here. But that's Augustine as well, right? He had his moments, and as much as he tried to pull everything together, the Confessions is a hodgepodge of different reflections and stray thoughts that he's having to deal with, that he recalls himself experiencing, and he doesn't understand anymore why he went through that. But he did. And so, that's about all I'll say on that. It's good to be done with it, but it's, I think it was a good learning process. So. Yes? Gotta hit me on the ethics, Mark, come on.
I'm not sure if I have a question as much as a comment that maybe you could respond to. I was thinking about the question, where are you, and what Augustine's trying to do in the Confessions, which he's writing as a kind of reflection back on his own life, right? Which is, and those reflections are going to be mediated through his own liturgical, communal experiences, right? And so when I'm also thinking about what you said about mastering Kant and knowing everything, and then somebody like Augustine, where you're constantly finding new things and having new insights. To what degree, to read the Confessions, to appreciate what's going on, do I need to be part of a community that's asking the kinds of questions that Augustine's interested in? Or can I just read it on my own and have the same, and discover what Augustine's inviting me to discover?
I think I would want to say, yes, community, that's good, and you need it in order to understand anything. Certainly my experience as a grad student was more isolated than that, although there was a community, right?
That's why I asked the question.
And so that, and then maybe that's just the, if it's true that, it's only in community that we can really come to understand in a deep way some of these thinkers who've lived in community and out of which their thought has grown, then the university is doing a real disservice to a lot of their PhD students who, can find it very difficult to manage, working full time with, reading and writing and on their own and going to conferences. So I'm not going to be able to make a stellar case for my own communal formation, except to say, it's sometimes said, you get this line sometimes in Protestant circles. I don't know if Catholics say it too, but I'm a priest, so so what you just said, it sounds good, but I'm dealing with X, Y, Z right now, and can you actually speak to that? And the theologians scratch their head and say, well, I haven't been to church in 3 years, but and so I think there is a gulf there, and Augustine got better with age in that respect. His sermons got shorter for one thing, punchier, but they're also he was more involved with his community. And so I was focusing on his early works where he's more isolated with his few compatriots in philosophy, and there's some real limitations there. You see the way that his attraction to the otherworldly aspects, if you will, of Platonic thought were more vibrant, and the way he put things, he even sort of came to regret and apologize for, and I think that's partly because how he did it, or where he was. And I think, my own location as a scholar like that probably is. It will probably take many more years, maybe raising children and having all these other obligations and needs and crises happen. That will finally, when I turn to Augustine at 35, as you turn to Augustine at 35, 45, 55, it's a very different experience. And suddenly what he's saying about infants makes sense, right? Because you've held one and you know that it can be very demanding, and you see yourself in them, and you see the human condition. So I think that's probably true, and there's no great way to sort of figure that out. I think, make that for younger people, make that community always happen. Anyway, that's just some thoughts. But you have follow up to that?
Well, I was just going to say one of the things. I studied Bernard Lonergan, and one of the critiques of people that study Lonergan is that they spend so much time trying to understand what Lonergan's saying that they never actually do what he says to do. And it strikes me Augustine's the same thing. We can focus so much time thinking about Augustine and what he's trying to say here instead of just doing what he said to do.
Right.
And isn't that what we're trying to do in the ACS program, is to invite, even at this university, we're trying to invite students into an ongoing quest of the question, right, the pursuit of the question. Not making sure they've memorized Augustine's answers to the question.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, I think that's right. I mean, there can be a sort of traditional, historically rich, deep study of Augustine's Confessions that's valuable to some people, and that maybe it'll sort of trickle down effect, makes a big impact. I'm sure there are studies that are like that. But it's not. I don't want to say it's not ideal, but it's not what Confessions is. It's not what he wanted Confessions to be. Let's put it that way. Right? It's out of love for your love, and to generate love in my readers that I write this, and whatever that means. It's certainly not that you would know what he thinks about, the doctrine of omnipotence, per se, inside and out. It has something a little bit a little bit more to do with life and community and yeah, that's well said.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.